Chairman. I agree with both of you in your testimony and comments so far in preparation for today. I think this is an extremely important tenet, one that we should strive to uphold going forward, and any exception to it should be taken very, very seriously. So I appreciate your comments on that. Having said that, I agree with you also that I think we're facing a very unique and dangerous global security crisis today. I can't compare it to 1950. It's different. They didn't have cyber warfare back then. They didn't have a nuclear North Korea. They didn't have an arms race in space. I think the need for integration between diplomacy and development and military capability has never been greater or more complicated. And because of that unique circumstance, I think, like General Marshall, General Mattis offers us a unique combination of skill sets and mindsets that make him an ideal candidate for right now, with certain cautions that you both have laid out. Having said that, and having broad experience from the Foreign Relations Committee here, I'm very concerned about the relationship between diplomacy and development debates inside the cabinet room between two military officers when it's a military option or a diplomatic option. Could you both speak to that with your personal experience of General Mattis? Dr. Hicks?
I'll begin. I think you're right to have that concern, particularly, if I may, on development. The last 15 years of war, I think, have brought home more than ever before to members of the military the importance of development, or the role, maybe more precisely said, the role it plays. But your average officer, I think, still maybe doesn't fully understand the role of USAID in particular. That said, I do think General Mattis, through both his role, well, his variety of roles, but particularly the roles as the head of U.S. then Joint Forces Command, looking broadly at the future and at the integration of the military with other instruments of power, and of course as the commander of U.S. Central Command, where a region like many others where you absolutely have to understand how these pieces integrate together, is critical. I think he will have a deep appreciation of the need for development and diplomacy experts that are non-military.
I guess I would have a couple of thoughts. The first is that it seems to me it's very rare that one has a choice between a military and a diplomatic option. The choice is much more likely to be diplomacy of one kind backed by a military option, or diplomacy of a different kind, maybe not backed by a military option. And so therefore what matters most is actually the cooperation between the State Department and the Defense Department. I was very privileged to serve along with Senator Sullivan under Secretary Rice, and to see the exceptionally close relationship that she had with Secretary Gates as Secretary of Defense. And you know, anybody who's in an administration tends to feel that way, but I thought I was seeing an exceptionally close integration of diplomacy and military power, and I think that's really the model. So I think the question might be more to General Mattis, if he's Secretary Mattis, with the Secretary of State.
Dr. Cohen, you had mentioned that, you know, that we're not the first ones to do this as a country. I mean, certain countries have done this historically, and some not so very well, and you've called that out in your writings. Would you relate to us just a little bit about the cautionary comments that you've made about that relative to other people's experience, other countries' experience with doing what we're talking about doing today, but also talk about the unique character of Dr. Mattis and why this might be a unique situation?
Well, let me start with General Mattis. For me, what I find myself focusing on is not just the experience and the expertise and so on. It is fundamentally my judgment about his character and his judgment. And that's why I think it's very unfortunate people have used the phrase mad dog. I've never heard anybody in the uniformed military refer to him as that. That is not what he is like. This is an extremely thoughtful, careful, prudent man. And I think that is a tremendously important thing. To speak to the history of civil-military relations, the fact is, say, if you look at the French or the Germans or even the Russians, when you begin to have retired generals as ministers of defense or ministers of war, you are setting up the kinds of tensions and problems and blurring that we talked about, and the kind of isolation of the military from normal politics. And in some ways, this is what has happened in Israel, which is probably for us the most interesting case, because it is a liberal democracy. But I know that country pretty well, and there is a serious problem with the politicization of the senior officer corps. There is a serious problem in distinguishing between the military advice of the serving chief of the general staff and a minister of defense who only a couple of years before was a general officer. And in fact, what's interesting is the Israelis have introduced, and they've actually recently increased, their own time gap between when you can take off the uniform, when you can run for public office and serve in those kinds of positions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Peters,